invited Gary Anderson to give a opening prayer tonight, and then we'll get going. Thanks.
Our Heavenly Father, we are grateful this evening for being able to be here in this historic building to further the cause of history. We're grateful for the namesake that we have of Leonard Arrington to foster these lectures and to be able to gather together all who desire to come, to listen and to learn. We ask thy blessings upon us this night, that things will go well and that we will learn what we came to learn. We ask these blessings in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
And then before we get started, I'd like to recognize a couple of people. First, James Arrington and Susan Madsen, Leonard's children, are with us tonight. And because it's James, I'll give him a plug for, he's going to do his show. Here's Brother Brigham, November 4th through the 6th at the Utah Theater. And he said it's the last time it's going to be done. So if anybody, he's sort of famous in the state for doing that. And then I'd like to also recognize Steve Snow, church historian and recorder, who's been a great supporter of the Arrington projects through the years. And it's nice to have you up in Cache Valley again. So, and now I'm going to turn it over to Steve Sturgeon, who's a former student of Patty Limerick's, for an introduction. So, thanks, Steve.
Dr. Patricia Nelson Limerick has had many unique experiences in her life, but I suspect that being introduced by an Episcopal priest in an LDS tabernacle in rural Utah would probably rank fairly high on that list. This is actually not the first time she is speaking here at the Logan Tabernacle, since she previously spoke here about 10 years ago. I want to start off first with the facts. Dr. Limerick is the faculty director and chair of the board of the Center of the American West, which hopes to promote a dialogue between different academic fields, government agencies, advocacy groups, and public citizens on topics pertaining to the past, present, and future of our region. The Center of the American West is located at the University of Colorado Boulder, where Dr. Limerick has been a longtime professor of history and environmental studies. Dr. Limerick is the author of numerous books, articles, essays, and op-ed columns, with her most well-known publication perhaps being the book, The Legacy of Conquest, The Unbroken Past of the American West. This book was one of several influential publications in the early 1990s that helped to spark a renewed interest in, reevaluation of, and understanding about the history of the American West. Dr. Limerick was appointed last year by President Obama and confirmed by the United States Senate to serve on the advisory board for the National Endowment for the Humanities. She has served as the president of several national academic organizations and has received numerous awards and recognitions, among them a MacArthur Fellowship. Perhaps one of her lesser-known honors was voluntarily serving as the official university fool at the University of Colorado during the 1980s and 1990s, a position from which I believe she has now retired, or at least been granted the status of fool emerita. Now for the color commentary. As Brad mentioned earlier, the reason I'm introducing Patty this evening is I was a graduate student in my previous life working with Patty Limerick. Under her direction and guidance during the 1990s, I obtained a master's degree and a PhD in American history. After finishing graduate school, I took a job at Utah State University, where I worked for a dozen years in the Special Collections Department of the library, before my career path went in a different direction, and I ended up wearing a piece of plastic around my neck. After I made the change to a religious vocation, I went through a period of self-reflection, wondering whether or not attending graduate school had ended up being a waste of time. Were the things I had acquired during my graduate studies still of any use to me? Upon further reflection, I realized that, in fact, much of my grad school experience still had meaning and relevance. Perhaps the most important thing I gained from my grad school years was meeting my wife, or at least that's what she keeps reminding me of, and I find it wise not to challenge her on that point. However, there were also numerous things I learned while working with Patty Limerick beyond just book knowledge. So if you will permit me, I would like to very briefly share with you the Gospel of Patty Limerick, according to Steve. First off, and this is an important one for all of you working on Arrington essays, words matter. Words are our friends. They have specific meaning and value, and they want to help us communicate our ideas to the world. Do not use them in a sloppy or casual or ill-fitting way. You would not treat your human friends that way, so do not abuse your word friends. Good writing is a passion for Patty. If you wrote a 3-page paper for her, you were likely to receive back a 4-page critique. Learning to write under Patty's tutelage was like getting lessons from Steph Curry on how to make 3-point shots. Patty's second commandment, don't panic, there's only 4. Keep it simple. It is incredibly easy and tempting to lapse into insider jargon when talking about our work and or our ideas, which as a result narrows the conversation to only those other people who understand and use the same jargon. Doing so diminishes the value of our ideas and work in the larger world at a time when we desperately need to encourage more dialogue, not less. The key is to break down complicated concepts into something more user-friendly. For example, my dissertation research focused on the topic of the political and environmental factors shaping water reclamation development in the post-World War II era of the American West. In other words, I wrote about building dams. This commandment does not mean dumbing down ideas, but rather expressing them in a way that invites others into the conversation. This leads to Patty's third commandment: listen to others. We live in an era in which we occupy informational silos, where we only listen to people who already share our point of view, thus reinforcing our self-perception that we are right and all other opinions are utterly wrong and should not even be allowed to be expressed. It is only when we breach the walls of our self-constructed silos that we can begin to hear and maybe even understand a different perspective. In my own dissertation research, I wrote about a congressman who was a passionate advocate for building dams, a point of view that I do not personally share. And yet, during the course of reading through his papers, I came to have an understanding for why he held that particular position. It did not change my own opinion, but it gave me food for thought and made it impossible for me simply to demonize and dismiss him. This connects to Patty's final commandment. It's complicated. Human nature has a tendency to insist on reducing everything down to 2-dimensional black and white categories, leaving out everything that does not conveniently fit. This is the equivalent of baking a flat piece of dough and upon removing it from the oven, declaring that it is a pie, even though it does not have any depth or filling. Reality is far more messy and complex than narrow, rigid categories allow, and pat answers almost never get around to actually addressing the question. Thus, to recap, words matter, keep it simple, listen to others, it's complicated. Stop and think for a moment how much more edifying our presidential election would be if the candidates followed these rules. I have found over time that all 4 of Patty's commandments have direct relevance and application to my current work. When I preach on Sunday mornings, I give a Patty Limerick sermon. Even how I lay out the words on the page, which looks like a free-form poem that has exploded, is something I learned from Patty. This is the legacy of Patty Limerick in my life. And so it is with great pleasure and gratitude that I introduce her to you as this year's Arrington Lecture speaker.
This teaching job is pretty good. Thank you so much. That's extremely moving to hear that. I do want to say a word about the official fool position, and I would like to bring the sources and cause of that to a local historical fact. My father grew up in Brigham City, and he went to Weber College for his first 2 years in Ogden, and he took there a course on Shakespeare that shaped him forever. And Leland Munson, I think, was the teacher. So I grew up hearing Shakespeare quoted, and certainly one of the characters in Shakespeare who's impressive and engaging is the fool, who appears from time to time. So that was my dream, was to take the Shakespearean fool and bring that to bear on higher education. I'm not sure if that produced any good at all, but it was certainly fun to do. And I just did get reappointed by our current president, so I'm still in that job, but that will not be my role tonight. So this is called Hair-Raising Tales from the Department of the Interior because people so often think that bureaucracies are boring. And so I thought the word hair-raising would be a good counter to that. We are headed at the last part of the speech to an affirmation of Utah's giant claim on historical significance. And we are also headed to a surprising, but, I'm going to conceal it, a surprising invitation that will be sort of the punchline. So, I have followed various life strategies that have worked out quite well, and one of them, it turns out, was following in Leonard Arrington's slipstream. So you can see that in print in my book, The Legacy of Conquest. If you look at pages 87 to 88, you'll see a very heavy reliance on the work of Leonard Arrington, pointing out the distribution of federal resources in the New Deal to Western states. I felt it was just a wonderful thing to be able to quote him in that. And then if you look at an essay that is in the collection, Something in the Soil, collection of my essays on pages 245 and 249, you'll see direct references to Leonard Arrington there. And then I thought this would be a good thing to share with you. In the mid-1990s, I gave a speech at the Mormon History Association, and I remember that occasion very happily. It was a big lecture, and just over to that side, Leonard Arrington was seated. And this is the passage that I read. I was giving a talk about whether Mormonism constitutes a culture or ethnicity. And I had just reviewed the great flowering of Mormon creative writing in the late 20th century. And so this is the passage I read at that time. If Mormon ethnicity is fading, why is the late 20th century seeing such a remarkable and impressive flowering of Mormon literature? Anyone troubled by the prospect of a disappearing Mormon identity should read the Mormon creative writers. Mormon novelists, Mormon short story writers, Mormon poets, Mormon essayists. In their work, a clear cultural identity thrives. This was, by the way, a time, 1994, when there were some tensions about the writings of historians in the church. Reading this literature, one's imagination begins to play with the prospect of what might happen if the church were to spend less time enforcing intellectual conformity and more time describing and celebrating this rich Mormon literature and translating it into plays, movies, music videos, and web pages. This technique would allow stories to do what stories have always done best, convey the real meanings and appeal of life within a rich cultural tradition. So I said that, and one person burst into applause, and that was Leonard Arrington. which is a moment I treasure. So here's our warning. Bureaucratic studies ahead. I don't actually think you'll need to seek refuge, but if you do, it's important for you to know that we are moving into the subject of bureaucracy. And this is a technique that a wonderful friend of mine, Randy Olson, who's a fellow who works on the effective communication of science, has taught me. But therefore, as you start to give a speech where there will be complexity and things that seem to fit better together than other things, it's good to just state to the audience what you are doing. And so here it is. He proposes that we structure a short statement to orient an audience with the and, the assertion of fact and context, the but, the dynamic contrast, and then the therefore. So this certainly speaks for itself, but the history of the federal government is of central importance, and the very existence of the Department of the Interior embodies the nation's paradoxical relationship to empire, and Congress's laws only acquire meaning and a role in people's lives when a bureaucrat implements them, and we will never understand anti-government attitudes until we reckon with the history of bureaucracy. But the history of bureaucracy is widely thought to be boring and tedious. Therefore, we are here to strategize to improve our delivery systems for emphasizing this crucial dimension of American history without losing our audience. That would be you. So if any distress signals, you should just make those where I can see them. And this is, I'm giving a speech tomorrow in Salt Lake on Juanita Brooks and Dale Morgan. I've been really quite dazzled and moved by reading them. And this is the phrase that Juanita Brooks uses to start her book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. At the outset, let me make myself clear. And then she goes on very bravely to say who she is and why she wrote this book. So this is my first statement of disclosure. I have many, many friends who work for federal, state, municipal, and county agencies, and I experience something I would have to call misery when I see blanket condemnations of bureaucrats. This is a concept that I learned recently. It's called the reclaimed epithet, where if you are part of a group that is a negative, a scornful term is used for your group, you reclaim that by taking possession of that term with pride. So Chicanos did that in the 1960s. Chicano was a pejorative term, and they used it with pride and reversed it to a term of affirmation. So here is a problem to consider with the word bureaucrat. When we like the conduct of a person who works with a bureaucracy, we remove that person from the category of bureaucrat, and we relabel that person a public servant. That is unfortunate because it produces a situation where the public servants are removed to a separate category and only tedious, vexing, small-minded people are left in the category of bureaucrat. So my hope is that bureaucrat can become a reclaimed epithet. And to just give a couple of examples of how that could happen, here is a widely admired person, Abraham Lincoln, who as a younger person aspired to become a bureaucrat, aspired to become the commissioner of the General Land Office. He wanted to be appointed to that position for various complicated reasons. And then, to play a weird card, here is a very, very famous writer of the United States, Ezra Pound, not a person who, I don't know that I ever understood one of his poems, but I knew they were important. Young people in the room, this is important for you. You can be, as I was, completely bewildered by an important poet, but you shouldn't say that. You should just say, what does that word, he uses it in such an interesting manner. What was the implication of that? Do that, which is different from saying you can't make head or tail of it, and it makes the professor feel engaged, and then it's all a happy experience on that. So this is Ezra Pound, and he was a troubled soul. And his mother, he was born in Idaho, which was always a little bit of a puzzle to me until recently. His mother wrote him when he was really getting quite a reputation as an American poet, and she said, "You should write your next poem. It should be a big poem about the American West and its history." And Ezra Pound wrote back to his mother and said, "What has the West ever done to deserve that?" So why was Ezra Pound born in Idaho, and why is he appearing in this talk? Because his father was an employee of the General Land Office. He was a member of the Department of the Interior, and he was stationed in Haley, Idaho, and that's why Ezra Pound was born there. Whether that was the happiest thing that ever happened to Idaho, I don't know, but it does take us back there. So back to sober substance. Here is the classic sort of map that we see that shows the American West and its distinctiveness. The green area there is the percentage of public lands within an individual state that is owned and managed by the federal government. It obviously doesn't include Indian reservations, which are tribally sovereign areas. If anybody in the room is not seeing a regional pattern in this map, ophthalmologists will be opening early tomorrow and you can go get their help. The distinctive configuration of the West, it's partly about the Forest Service, but it's the National Park Service, it's the Bureau of Land Management, it's the military, various reasons why so much of the land has remained in federal ownership. Department of Interior with those agencies of National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, and Fish and Wildlife Refuges is a very big part of that configuration. Here is an inquiry that I think backs up the case for historical significance that I'm making tonight. Our friend Quintard Taylor, who is a wonderful historian at the University of Washington in the 1990s, he looked over the census reports for 1870, 1880, 1890 for the western states and territories. He defined these categories of cowboys and clerks quite broadly. So in ways that would be troubling to some Westerners, sheep herders were counted as cowboys, and that's not going to go over well in some circles. Clerks were broadly defined people who worked in mercantile situations, or banks, and also people who worked for governmental agencies. Now you'll notice that the pattern here is that it's only in one census, when the cattle boom in the West was at its peak before its collapse in 1887, only one census, 1880, are there more cowboys than clerks in the American West. The clerks are narrowly ahead in 1870, and then they are dramatically ahead in 1890. So there is a figure that you would be hard put, if asked, to say what Western movie you remember where the clerk was very handsome and very striking and was at the center of attention. The not so charismatic image of the clerk, I don't know if anyone ever offered John Wayne the chance to play a clerk, but I think we know what his response would have been to that. This isn't to say that there haven't been interesting bureaucrats in film. This is Mel Brooks, the territorial governor in Blazing Saddles, which is quite I'll have to say, I just thought it was a wonderful movie, and that may discredit me as a Western historian, but there's an interpretation of a federal bureaucrat. After 1873, the territorial government was under Interior. And then there are efforts to take the Indian agent. This is Jimmy Stewart as Tom Jeffords, the Apache agent, and there's an effort to give a little glamour or handsomeness to the clerk, the bureaucrat. Literature is certainly full of interesting studies of bureaucracy. Franz Kafka's Castle is beyond bearing. I think I was 55 years old before I had the courage to read that book, and bureaucracy. David Foster Wallace's book published posthumously on the IRS is quite a great thing. This is a wonderful book. Stephen Graham Jones wrote a book about an Indian agent among the Blackfeet, and it's really worth your time to read that. And I'm just open to more examples of great literature about bureaucrats, which is a rather brief list, you'll notice here. So, well, hoping that will grow. This is the early 21st century is, in fact, a great time for a renaissance in bureaucratic studies. There have been studies of the federal agencies in the West. Tom Alexander wrote one of them. Those have happened, but we have reached really something like a critical mass of a vast number of really good articles and books tracking the on-the-ground impact and lives of bureaucrats. And in every day's newspaper, more or less, if anyone's still reading newspapers, you can see federal bureaucracies front and center as matters of civic concern. The TSA has frequent occasions of revelations of malfunction within the TSA screening processes. The Secret Service has had a number of very embarrassing episodes of failed delivery of its services. Veterans Administration, Health Services, the IRS is the commissioner is brought before the Congress quite often for not very pleasant conversations. the State Department, email management, the digital rollout of the Affordable Care Act that took forever to get into a functioning state. I'm sure that that could be added to. So bureaucracy is very much at the center of civic discontent and dismay. So here is the main character that I live with. This is not the author's happiest draw in life, although I did it to myself. But this is my main character, the Department of the Interior. This is the Stuart Lee Udall building in Washington, D.C. And this doesn't help. Here is my main character as an organizational chart. You may remember that Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, they didn't really do organizational charts for their characters, and maybe we would have been able to read long Russian novels more easily if they had done organizational charts. But here is the interior organizational chart, and I don't know that we really have to ponder this with care. There's the secretary and the deputy secretary, and then there's the on the far side, the National Park Service. Underneath the one, well, there's lots of assistant secretaries there, but you can see it's quite complicated and it's quite tangled. That you have the dam building agency that Steve may not be the biggest fan of that, but would write in scholarly care and thoroughness about if he were to do that. And the National Park Service being in the same department, that's quite an interesting thing to have the dam building agency and the Park Service in the same place. Oops. So this is the question that might be coming to your mind. What's going on here? Why is this woman kind of sneaking up on confessing that I am trying to write a reflective book-length essay on the relationship between the American West and the Department of the Interior? It is important to say that I have not lost my mind, and I have no intention of writing a comprehensive history of all those agencies, but I do think it is a form of public service to have reflective essays thinking about this department that has so shaped the American West on the ground in so many ways. To get going on this, years ago, I did a series at our Center of the American West at the University of Colorado, where I brought the former secretaries of the Interior for interviews. I usually say the living secretaries of the Interior as if I had a choice, as if I could have brought in Roosevelt's Secretary Harold Ickes, which I would have enjoyed very much, but my timing was poor for that. So I brought them and I interviewed them. I prepared extensively. I interviewed them privately. I interviewed them in front of an audience. I drove them around. I had conversations with them, and it was a remarkable armchair quarterbacking experience. This funny phrase here, our partners were the Nature Conservancy in sponsoring these events. The head of the Colorado Nature Conservancy office, he stood up at one of the meetings. I think we had Secretary Babbitt, Bruce Babbitt there. So Secretary Babbitt is sitting in the front row. Charles Bedford from the Nature Conservancy comes up to the podium, and he welcomes everyone, and he says that he knows that many people have come to others in the series, and then he says the weirdest thing. He says that he knows that everyone there has really been fascinated watching Patty Limerick's serial affairs with the secretaries of the Interior. Bruce Babbitt looks nervous. I mean, it's an uncomfortable moment all around there. And I don't know why he said it the second. I never really got a chance to ask him. But I walk up to the podium, and just as I reach there, I think, I've got it. And I say, oh, Charles Bedford misspoke. He meant to say Patty Limerick's cerebral affairs with the secretaries. So here's my improbable life. Steve mentioned listening to various people. Here I am sitting. On one side, I have Stuart Udall, Kennedy and Johnson's Secretary of the Interior, and an important person from Mormon cultural history. And on the other side, I have Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, James Watt, who said that his children thought his first name was controversial because he always appeared in the newspaper as controversial James Watt. So there I am, and I have brought them together. I've invited them to come to Boulder together. We drove to the airport with a little van to pick them up. You're going to the airport to pick up Jim Watt and Stuart Udall, who had never spent any time together. And in many ways, they represent, if you don't ask deeper questions, they represent opposite positions on environmental issues. And as you're going to the airport to pick them up, you think, whose idea was this? And then you have to think, oh, it was mine. Okay, so really a wonderful adventure to have them. The series was called Inside Interior. This is former Secretary George W. Bush's secretary, Gail Norton. And I put this in here just to show you how great life is as a public intellectual, what adventures you have as a public intellectual. We had a lot of security with the sitting Secretary of the Interior, and I was worried about protesters and disruption. So I had told Secretary Norton and the other interviewer, law professor Charles Wilkinson, that if we did have protesters, I wanted to be the one to go down to speak to the protesters, and they should just stay on the stage. So we did have protesters. There were some folks who stood up with banners and began shouting. So I did what I said I wanted to do. I went down to the audience, and I spoke to the protesters, and I asked them to meet me for lunch the next day. I would take their concerns to the secretary. I did everything I could. And there was just a streak of bewilderment building up for me as I did that, because I went to quiet the protesters, and they got louder. Well, that is very mystifying. Why is that happening? And it wasn't till I had to have them taken out finally. They wouldn't stop shouting. When I got back up to the stage, I sat down and I thought, that was very peculiar. I go to quiet them and they get dramatically louder. And then it suddenly comes into my mind that I was wearing my lapel mic. So I went down to the protesters. They were much cleverer than I. They think, this is good news. And they start shouting into my mic. And I am the one person in the room oblivious to this idiotic situation. So, oh, for heaven's sake. So that, I will just tell you, the life in public on tense issues when you're trying to be a mediator and so on, I was very angry at myself for doing that. That seemed really, really stupid. And I couldn't sleep when we got home. And so I was sitting downstairs reading. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, that finally turned funny. And it still is. And then the Forest Service, what could happen is the Forest Service had its centennial, 2 months after this, and I was back in Washington, and I was to introduce Secretary Norton, and when I saw her, I was wearing a lapel mic, and she had a sort of, oh no, here you are, a lapel mic. So anyway, what fun, public intellectual. So here is the word that I am finding very helpful in my thoughts about interior, and actually my thoughts about everything that is agitating us in the nation today, and has agitated us in the past. So the word paradox has come into my world as a great aid to thought. This beautiful quotation from the Supreme Court Justice, there is nothing like a paradox to take the scum off your mind. That's something to take to heart, because that's, in case there's any question, that's not good to have scum on your mind. The paradox defines something such as a situation that is made up of two opposite things that seem impossible. It seems that those two things could not be part of the same idea or phenomenon or person, but it is actually quite true and possible that those two things can be in one. A statement that seems to say two opposite things, but that may be true, and then should there be any question about what scum is, there's a definition of that, but I don't think we really need that. Here is the core paradox of the Department of the Interior thought of in historical terms, and it is a paradox the width of the continent. The United States was a nation that set an example for the world in rebelling against empire. That republic, setting that example, almost instantly acquired its own empire and built a governmental structure that bears a direct resemblance to colonial governance. So, U.S., known for eternity as a place of rebelling against empire. United States then acquires contiguous land and gets into the empire business itself. The Department of the Interior comes into being in 1849 as a cobbled together equivalent of an empire's home office. The General Land Office was created in the early 1800s, the the Office of Indian Affairs in the same vein. So there are agencies existing, but they are all brought together in 1849 as the Department of the Interior. So this is a paradox. It's the irritation over British land and Indian policies was one of the big provocations for the American Revolution. The Proclamation of 1763 tried to restrict American settlers from moving into Indian territory, and that was a great source of irritation that led to the Revolution. And here the nation, within a little bit more than a half century, ends up with its own empire and a new department coming into being. But these are all the land acquisitions that, of course, built the nation. So here's the confession going back to Juanita Brooks and saying that we should disclose ourselves on this. I hope to do at least a little to moderate the anti-government feelings of our time, especially in Western land management, and yet, the cruelest paradox of all, undertaking an honest historical exploration of the Department of the Interior requires me to affirm as well as challenge anti-government attitudes, paying attention to hair-raising stories about patronage, corruption, and scandal in the General Land Office and the Office of Indian Affairs. Those in the 19th century, those two governmental agencies represented just a great flow of money and temptation going by people who could not resist that flow of temptation. So even if my intention is to try to lessen the troubles of our time about attitudes towards government, I have to be honest in saying to some degree I have to affirm, or at least explore, the reasons for distrust of government. Here's one example. The Department of the Interior administered the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was a festival of corruption, administered by the Department of the Interior. Every once in a while, a public figure, our President Obama has said several times on several occasions that we should approach renewable energy as we approach the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. We should show the same spirit that built the railroad as we took on these challenges of our time. For a Western American historian, that's oh no, do something with your speechwriter quickly because there's a problem here. We're going to build renewable energy as we built the railroad. Oh no, we're going to be bribing congressmen the way we did then. We were going to be bringing in immigrant laborers to put in terrible working conditions. So Chinese workers, Irish immigrant workers. So it's often used as a historical analogy, and it is used with ignorance of the story of Interior. On a better note of paradox running through Interior, here is a prime example of why it is good to use the word paradox rather than contradiction or inconsistency. The National Park Service, this is their 100th anniversary, this is their 1916, the key phrase from the Enabling Act creating the Park Service, often read and presented as a contradiction or an inconsistency to conserve the scenery and the natural and historical objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. I used to teach that in classes, and I used to ask students to notice those are contradictory. To enjoy these things in this moment and yet at the same time preserve them unimpaired, to conserve and to enjoy, those seem to be at odds with each other. And then, after years of contemplating this, I now feel I should apologize to all of my students to whom I said that. There's one I could do that. Because this is fundamentally a different statement, a legislative statement of our mission of life on the planet as human beings. To enjoy our time on the planet, to take pleasure in, to live from the resources of the planet, and to leave something for those who will follow us. That, rather than being an unbearable contradiction or inconsistency, it's a paradox that we live with every day of our lives as people in this transitory moment on the planet. The paradox of infrastructure. Here we are thinking of parks that are considered to be all about nature. Well, roads, sanitation. This is a book I am not going to write. This would be my book, which has a wonderful title, Patricia Nelson Limerick, Bathroom Reading, A History of Sewage and Sanitation in the National Parks. A really important book and an important reminder that to experience nature, there had better be some engineers working on these issues, or the experience of nature is going to be considerably less pleasant. Okay, soon we're moving into the Utah part here in a minute here. The key paradox of the last 120 years or so is this one, that progress, the meaning, the definition, the ownership of the idea of progress changed course. And the Department of the Interior was one of the principal arenas where that happened. So, where through much of the 19th century, the federal government's mission had been to transfer the public domain to private ownership. That's what the General Land Office did. Subdividing the great sprawl of the public domain and allocating that for private ownership. The shift in the late 19th century, early 20th century, to maintaining that land, the public domain, and permanent federal ownership, that was a giant and disorienting change. It goes beyond whiplash, it goes beyond a sudden reversal of course. It is an amazing reversal in the meaning of progress. Progress meant moving the land from public domain to private ownership, and then very abruptly, progress acquired a distinct meaning of keeping that land in permanent federal ownership and management and not moving it into private property. That is such a vast change that we cannot be surprised that this shift still leaves some people and some communities unsettled and rattled in this time. Okay, the significance of Utah in this story. This is a quotation from Dale Morgan's book, The State of Deseret, from 1940. The last phrase, the damned rascals who administer the government, that is, those quoted words are from Brigham Young. So here's a paradox, which has been around for a while. The Mormons had a profound respect for government and governmental forms, Dale Morgan tells us, but disrespect for and outright distrust of, Brigham Young's quotation, the damned rascals who administer the government. And that's not both of those are true. That's a total paradox, the respect and admiration for the government and the sense that it's fallen into bad hands. Here is a different route into the Union. This is the big outline is the state of Deseret that was brought into existence with the hope of applying for statehood in 1850 as the state of Deseret, skipping the phase of territorial governance and going straight to statehood. So the Mormons had united in this plan for Deseret. And then, of course, the much smaller scale of Utah, the territory of Utah, which doesn't actually appear in this map particularly, but you can see what a difference of scale, how vast the state of Deseret was going to be. That represents quite a different route into the Union. And I am so in debt to the people who support the Leonard Arrington series, the people who invited me, for giving me this chance to think about this, because I really hadn't. So I got reoriented in part by Dale Morgan, the noted historian of many, many things in the West as well as in Utah. His first publication was called The State of Deseret. It's about the ghost legislature that was created, again, in hopes of going straight into statehood, but endured in a kind of parallel existence to the territory, what the federal government created, the territory of Utah. Deseret continued even as late as 1872 as a kind of ghost government. So here's what, in reading that book in the last few weeks, I thought, well, that's interesting. An ordinance of the High Council of Salt Lake City established, quote, a land record and fees for the surveyor and clerk in September 30th, 1848. So just really barely a year after the first settlement. Then, with the creation of the state of Deseret, very early in the existence of the state of Deseret, the Deseret legislature created the offices of county recorder and surveyor general for land titles. So here was my chance to recover from what I had paid no attention to, where my attention had just been so much in a complete preoccupation with the struggles over territorial government and plural marriage, how much that had polarized the church and the federal government. I had never said to myself, well, what was going on with land policy, which is usually the most controversial issue of Western settlement. So here's two quotations indicating that, in fact, there were local policies long before the federal government got into play. Remember, in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo brings the territory that becomes Utah into the nation, and the federal government is not ready to get to work on administering land law or much of anything else there. So here is, of course, the famous distinctive pattern of Mormon settlement, and it fits in an interesting, well, let's just say there is nothing else in Western American history that is the equivalent of this. From 1847, with the first settlements, the Mormons in Utah, until 1869, federal land management was not in operation. There was no general land office. There's no other place where there's 22 years where the federal government is not there allocating land. And in those years, this distinctive land pattern gets into play, where there's, as I'm sure probably everyone in the room knows here, there's town lots, and people reside on town lots, and usually at the edges of the town, the farmlands are there in smaller allocations than you would get through the federal land system. And people live in a compact community where they're part of a civil society, and then they go to their farms in the course of their days. So this is governed by what the Mormon people in church called stewardship. And stewardship is a word that is not declared in the National Federal Homestead Act. The true principle of stewardship, as Brigham Young summarized it later, was to hold emphatically everything we possessed upon the altar for the use and benefit of the kingdom of God, and men shall be as stewards over that which they possess. Well, okay, we're not going to expect the federal government to pass a law talking about the altar for the benefit of the kingdom of God, but men shall be as stewards over that which they possess. That's a pretty good idea. So, okay, so there we have the pattern, and then we have that quite well established in that interlude between 1847 and 1869, 1868 with the appearance of the railroad in the West, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. There's recognition on the part of Mormon leaders and Mormon regular citizens that things are really going to change. Things are really going to change with the arrival of the railroad and a much more significant Gentile presence. And at this moment, 1868, there is no federal basis for Mormon land ownership. There's been no federal authentication of those Mormon land claims. So Congress, with Mormon leadership consent, passes a bill creating a Mormon land office that comes to Salt Lake in 1869. So, okay, so now we have what will certainly seem to be like an episode of great conflict coming up, because we have a robust form of land settlement that is not a match and may even in some ways be antithetical to federal land policy. So a person might think that's not going to go well. That's going to be full of very bitter conflicts and very great tension. But it wasn't. The church organized residents to act on this, to go to the General Land Office, to present their claims. They found ways in which, for instance, a bishop could take the 160-acre unit of land and then divide it up among the people with token small amounts for sales, to pay for the sales so that the same living patterns could continue. But with the bishop claiming the 160 acres and then subdividing it. So it's a very coordinated response to this change. William Clayton, who was Brigham Young's personal secretary, was the sort of emissary between the Mormon people and the new bureaucrats in the land office, and was very effective at carrying messages back and forth. So that is a moment where I wonder what happened to me, because I read Leonard Arrington's Great Basin Kingdom, and I did not pay attention to a very clear set of pages where Mr. Arrington talked about this process. Until 1869, the Mormons had no legal property rights in Utah. That is, while Congress was confirming land titles in other western states and territories, Mormon titles were not confirmed, nor the benefits of the Homestead Act applied to Utah. So there it all was, and for some reason I didn't really notice how interesting that was. So here are the questions that I am asking myself, and I guess maybe before I ask you those questions, I just want to summarize. In that period, 1847 to 1869, Mormon land allocation had features and qualities that presented an alternative, and in some ways a better alternative to federal land policy. The 22-year delay on the arrival of federal land administration through the General Land Office in Utah is really unusual in American history, and it may still linger in local memory. I don't know if it does. The arrival of federal authority over land title was surprisingly smooth and congenial. It was a process that, in fact, is sometimes called one of reconciliation, an interesting term, of Mormon land titles with federal land laws. In other words, in the arena of land titles, relationships between the federal government and the Church of Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ were far calmer than they were in other arenas. The Mormon system, even with the federal system in play, avoided litigation, church leaders settled disputes, avoided speculation, which plagued the land system, the homestead system in other areas where people briefly homesteaded and then sold their holdings to others or speculated for higher prices. And the Mormon system created homes and farms that lasted and stayed with the original families at a much higher rate than in other parts of the West. So that's why another historian, Lawrence Lee, writing an article about this in 1960, concluded that in Utah, the spirit of the original homestead ideal, given expression by the advocates and reformers in the 1840s and 1850s in the eastern United States, the spirit of what led to the Homestead Act was truly reflected in Mormon homesteading. On other frontiers, I'm still quoting Lawrence Lee, homesteaders moved by individualistic principles chose to sell their relinquishments or deeded their perfected entries for speculative profits. Mormons, operating on a cooperative principle, used the Homestead Act to validate a lifetime ownership of their farmlands. And then one more line from Lawrence Lee. And thus the reformers, the East Coast reformers, who had popularized the homestead idea, had their cherished dream realized in at least one spot in the United States in Utah Territory, the kingdom on the top of the mountains. So these are the questions I puzzle over. How does this distinctive Utah story of land claiming and allocating a very distinctive relationship with the key agency in the Department of the Interior, the General Land Office, how does that echo in our time? Why does the national media miss this important historical element when covering recent conflicts over the public lands, many of which have involved Utah or Mormon people living elsewhere? And the key question, would reckoning with this historical element help us understand the dilemmas and conflicts and tensions of our time? So, in the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton and Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt imposed a national monument, the Grand Staircase Escalante Monument, over rural Utah Mormon objections. Now I ask myself, after this whole getting reacquainted with this history, or getting acquainted for the first time maybe, I wonder how that phase before the General Land Office's Utah opening, how much that might provide a deeper context for response to the monuments and the use of the 1906 Antiquities Act. I wonder if Secretary Bruce Babbitt, if he had studied this, if he had read Great Basin Kingdom with more care than I apparently did, if he could have thought, now that's something to think about. That's something to recognize, that before federal land management came to Utah, the Mormons were practicing something that really was a better process, more tranquil and productive form of settlement. Could we refer to that? Could we discuss that as we talk about this possible monument? I should say, by the way, you may not all know this, but Secretary Babbitt, after the response to Grand Staircase Escalante, with a very arbitrary federal designation of that, changed his operating mode. When he wanted to do a national monument, he went to the places, he visited, he chatted with people, he recruited local support, so that the Utah example actually really changed his conduct. Okay, now we are going into, this is my favorite character. I just love this character. I like this person very much. I don't know who this person is. He doesn't have a very clear identity, but he is, he's falling over and he's very happy. He's just, look at it, he's just a joyful person slipping on a treacherous surface. So that might be me now. So I would like to put forward the idea that when worthy contestants meet and engage each other directly, there is reciprocated respect in that. There is something close to honor when people take on a contest with respect and earnestness. So, here's Congressman Rob Bishop. I am in his district at this moment. So here is my hope, is that Congressman Rob Bishop and I, this is on your mark, get set, and turn hindsight into foresight. That is our slogan at the Senate of the American West, turning hindsight into foresight, looking at history and applying it to the present. I've wanted to propose this for quite a long time. I don't know if I have a very settled position on public land management. I don't know if Congressman Bishop knows about the history that I just reviewed in the last 10 or 15 minutes, where Mormon land allocation was in some ways superior to, suggested an alternative that might have been superior to federal land policy. I don't know if he knows about that. I don't know if he steers by that, but I would take joy in talking about that historical aspect with him. We might get off to a festive start with a limerick that I wrote today about this subject. I do have an obligation with my last name, so here we go. People are drawn to a fight, to conflict, friction, and plight, but I'm forced to be bland on the subject of land and concede that the Mormons were right. Okay, so, and then, you don't know this, but, or I guess you do because I mentioned that he lives in my father's hometown, Brigham City. He was a retired history teacher. I'm a history teacher. He loves community theater. I love community theater. The owner of the Boulder Dinner Theater is on the board of Center of the American West, so I think we're ready to chat. And if the conversation goes well and we get to really pulling this off, we have an optional topic for the discussion, which is the Bears Ears, possible designation of the Bears Ears Monitor in southern Utah. So, to conclude, Utah's great value to Western American history. Utah represents an essential challenge to the notion that the federal exercise of centralized authority appeared in the same form everywhere and homogenized the West. That didn't happen. Utah offers an irresistible reminder of the consequence and significance of local variation. Utah offers us basically comparative history located right in our midst and not in a distant locale. Utah's history in the unsettled world of federal state jurisdictions, authority, and claims of legitimacy give us a chance to compare. Things that we assume to be just the way things were, normal, predictable, to say, do we know how normal and predictable those were? So, in other words, Congressman Bishop and I have, and anybody who would like to join us in our conversation, are set to have quite a lively conversation. This is the last slide. This is Cliven Bundy. In March of 2000, he was, of course, active in 2014 as a very visible figure, and his sons have been very active on raising questions about public lands management. In March of 2016, March of this year, I went to a conference in another state, and I met a person who I guess I had been in touch with in a certain way. He'd followed some of the things I'd written. Anyway, he came up and chatted with me, and he said he wanted to tell me that he felt that the Bundys, there was no question that the Bundys had broken the law and that they should take their penalty for that. But he wanted me to know that there was more to what the Bundys thought about history than I would realize from reading from the newspaper, that they did have a more complicated, more grounded, it was, whatever it was I might have learned from the New York Times, I hadn't learned what he knew because his father, the man who's speaking to me, his father ranched next to the Bundys, to Cliven Bundy, and he felt that I should open the door to thinking that there were things I didn't know about the Bundys. So, I feel quite certain that this view of that period in the 19th century, 1847 to 1868, should be something we think about and talk about before we return to the usual lines of division. We may return to the lines of division exactly as we left them, but we may see a different horizon at that point. Thank you. So this is an extremely rare, you don't know what it was a rare experience to be introduced in a tabernacle by an Episcopalian priest, that's all true, but this might be, I was told to speak for 40 minutes and I actually did that. 42, because we started it, I was very careful at noticing that, so that leaves a couple of minutes for questions anyway, so Yes, 7:20, and look at that, it's 8 o'clock. No one will believe this. In Boulder, Colorado, they will never believe I finished on time. It's incredible. So I think the people who were kind about praying for my performance seem to have helped me out here. So thank you for that. So questions? Yes, please.
So, with this person that was talking to you about the Bundys, what is sort of, did he bring up anything particular with their sense of history as to why it was more complicated?
No, well, there wasn't time. It was, this is the only important lesson from this, is when you meet someone really interesting at a conference and you were rushing off to give your speech, let the audience wait for you to give your speech and get the person's address. It seems very obvious, but I know his name. I don't want to hound him, but I think now, with what I have been thinking over the last couple of weeks, I will find this person. I think there's a chance. I'm speaking at the Utah State Historical Society tomorrow, and I'm a little awash in the dream that this person is going to be there. So my sense was, I had made in my speech at the conference, I was, or maybe somewhere someplace I had made in public a kind of mocking statement about the Bundy's grasp on history. So he knew that about me, and he wanted to help me get past that. But then we had to race away, and I didn't get the address. But I'm dreaming that I will meet him tomorrow, and if not, the St. George area is going to be activated to find him for me, because that's just too interesting. And he is a wonderful person. I knew that much about him. I know enough to know that that was a person whose opinion I would really want to hear. So, but I'm assuming it's something. I mean, is it possible that they are the ones who noticed that there was a long spell, a significant formative spell, where the Mormons administered lands without the federal government in their way, so that when the Bundys say this land was ours originally, are they taking Lawrence Lee's article from 1960? I mean, I don't know. I have no idea. But I'm yearning to know more. And thank you for my guess is that you are frustrated and appropriately, well, why can't you tell us? And that's exactly how I feel. So now I've got you to share my feelings. It's really good. So thank you. Yeah.
There's another perspective that we have in Cache County, and that is that in Theodore Roosevelt's era, because of the total devastation of the watershed to the east, such that the surveyor had to take hay to feed the horses when he was surveying that area, this county petitioned Theodore Roosevelt to protect the watershed. And so there's another aspect of that may not relate
That's
to the
great.
earlier period, but may relate to a later period, which was the beginning of
Uh-huh.
the National Park Service.
Right. That's a great point. The point of the watershed here becoming so degraded that residents asked the federal government, asked Theodore Roosevelt and his conservation people to come in and stabilize that. I am totally pleased to include that, because in fact that is a pattern, that to see federal authority as imposed against the protests of the locals. Well, first, that's not what happened in 1868 or 1869. It was, okay, let's work this out. And the fact that there are circumstances that may not figure in Bundy family folklore, but should be in the picture, and really in some ways all that we're saying is what we try to say well, not everybody in the United States is trying to say this right now, but that overgeneralization is a terrible mistake. And when we say, well, here's the Mormon attitude on this, walk away from us at that point, because we have lost diversity, we've lost the complexity and variation in that. So that's an excellent point for that. Whatever it was that was going on in the mid-19th century has to be put in the picture with what the consequences of soil science and studies of erosion and recognition of the impact of grazing. That's not something that people intuit. That's something that people can make some bad mistakes about and then think, well, better do something about it. So thank you. That's a very useful addition. Yeah. So how would this fit with that, with the Dakota pipeline? Right. Now, my understanding on that might be a little different. That what I think I understand about the Dakota pipeline and the protest of the Standing Rock Sioux is that the federal government did not perform its obligations in tribal consultation. So there is a chance that the fight is not so much about pipelines on Indian land as it is about the failure of the federal government to do what they're supposed to do, which is really talk it through and get tribal consent, that they jumped some steps and stages in that. So it seems as if there's a lot of Indian people saying that's what went wrong, and that goes wrong in other places as well, that the federal government undertaking a major potentially environmentally disruptive project is really supposed to go through steps and stages, and that has been followed in some places and not others. In my home state, we have an exhibit at the State Historical Society, which was supposed to be on the Sand Creek Massacre, and there were obligations for tribal consultation, and those obligations got lost in a rush. And so that's the same issue there. So even though it's a historic exhibit, the same failure of now the feds and the state governments have an obligation to consult. So I think that's the core bedrock issue of the protests in North Dakota is consult. Hi, there you are up there. Hi. Well, you've been there all along.
I think this is a great thesis that you put forward, and it really applies, as far as I can tell, to the civic or irrigable lands near towns. What about the vast so-called throwaway lands that eventually end up in the Bureau of Land Management and large monuments that you're talking about? I don't know that they have that sense of land allocation within the Mormon system or the federal system afterwards for those lands, which is the huge majority of interior lands, if I have it right.
I think I think probably everyone heard him about, what about the dry places? What about the arid places? This is why I appreciate that very much, because that's why I just think the historical starting point for discussions of contemporary issues is so good and so promising, because everything that you would say about the period from 1847 to 1868, you would have to say most of the land we're speaking of is comparatively well supplied with opportunities for irrigation. And so if we are to take my Limerick, which has a very positive message there, we would then, I don't think we could write another Limerick, but we could put a footnote on this Limerick that says, and for that last line, and concede that the Mormons were right, we could put a footnote that says, and one reason why that was a successful plan was because it was taking place in irrigable land, and the many areas of southern Utah are quite different from that. And so whatever lesson we take from this period, we must put it in the physical, geographical, hydrologic context in which this system, I mean, it did seem to work better than what was happening in Kansas, 160-acre plots, too big, poor stewardship, no reference to that. Then I think we could make, if we were to have these conversations, maybe a clumsy transition, maybe a graceful transition to saying, well, those ideas were quite suitable for a particular hydrology and soil conditions. There's no reason to think that we just pick those up and plunk those down on another kind of land and get the same good results. That doesn't make any sense. So I think the historical framework permits a discussion that might lead in that direction of saying that the arid lands are, I guess what I would really want to do is to take the ideas that were at play in the highest ideas in 1847 to 1868 of stewardship. What does stewardship mean when you apply it to arid lands as opposed to irrigable lands? What does it mean to allocate the land in a way that builds civic community and permits people to live in relationship to each other? What would that mean in an arid place? So to take the governing ideals and move those to different physiographic regimes, that seems really promising to me. And it seems a lot more promising than let's start in the opposed battle lines that we're in right now and just go at it, but to say, we're taking a little time travel before we do that. That's what I think the underexploited power of history is, to take us out of the present moment and to look at the context of decisions that either the decisions we admire now or the decisions we shudder over, but to think, what was the context of that, and then come back to our times. And then maybe, if we can really pull it together, think about the people of the future and say, what would we do now to earn a good judgment from the people of the future? So, well, what a utopian I am. My goodness, this is really full of innocent faith. So I did finish on time, but I think we're close to where we should probably be. If there's one more question, we could maybe do one more. Yes, please.
I'd like to just see if I can complicate more mid-19th century story. This is the period when, as a result of the discovery of coal, Mormon communities had a great influx of capital, largely as they traded with people heading west. And in the course of that, they used a lot of that capital to build up what we would now call an infrastructure, a set of collectively shared things like canals and other forms that allow the society as a whole to prosper. And so, in fact, I think you might want to turn your story maybe 180 degrees and think about what happened in 1869 as, in some ways, the end of that shared system of mutuality, of a deep sense of collective action in building the infrastructure necessary for prosperity, and instead entering into a period more familiar in American history of relative individualism, individual proprietorship, and with that, a decline in stewardship as a governing framework, to the extent that it was assumed that the whole society was going to survive, which in 1848 was not necessary.
Was that clear?
So I might turn it inside out and talk about the end of the collective experience and the coming of the radical individualism as not necessarily the mark of a smooth transition, but rather the breaking up of what had been a smooth form, a remarkable form of the planting of a colony.
Right. Thank you. That's really very stimulating. And I know that I'm, as always in this topic, a weird combination of mostly outsider to Mormon history.
Oh, I'm way more outside than you.
Well, okay. Well, congratulations. I guess I don't know what to say on that one, but I feel like I'm also, because of my family background and so on, sort of an insider on this one. And I just feel like I have a sense that structure that you're after there is a difficult one to work out, because any community of people who are a purposeful community are going to feel that things are slipping away from them, and they'll have narratives about how in an earlier era they were genuinely a gathering, and then that was attenuated by various things of a next generation, the Puritans with the failure of the second generation to convert properly. And so, I mean, all kinds of things can happen that make you think we used to have it and now we don't. So your framework there, I think, is probably subject to a lot of good illuminating notions about what changed with the arrival of the railroad and the end of the era that I was focusing on. But I also wondered how we are to sort out that we used to be a group that thought about community, and now we are slipping towards individualism. And maybe it's the Puritans who are on my mind now, that's just a constant movement that is hard to calibrate and hard to get with precision. And I know that we could go on, and I also know that we could just do that, that people have been really wonderful about sitting here on that. But I appreciate your thoughts very much, and I want to contemplate them more. And I really want to thank you for this occasion and for this chance to think about some stuff that seems important. So appreciate that.